So we're going to hear from Dr. Matthew VanDyke, the Interim Department Chair for Advertising and Public Relations at the University of Alabama. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Matt.
Thank you so much, Allison. Let me see if I can share screen real quick. And welcome to this year's Science Communication Summit. As Allison mentioned, my name is Dr. Matt VanDyke. I'm currently an associate professor and the interim department chair for the Department of Advertising and Public Relations at the University of Alabama. Recently, I was also appointed as our faculty lead for our college's Science Communication Initiative, and I'm super excited to participate in today's summit with you. So, for better or worse, when I reflected on representations of science and popular culture that inspired and motivated me, the earliest example I could think of, again, for better or worse, were representations of science, discovery science as depicted through Jurassic Park. Now, a lot of you participating in our summit today have already been successful at connecting the work that you do or that your organization does with popular culture. And some of you might be thinking, hey, the work that I do or the work that my organization does is also really cool. And we need to identify opportunities to connect what we do to strategic opportunities like instances in popular culture. That's primarily where I want to focus my discussion today. Is luckily for us, there is a broad body of literature informed by public relations, marketing, science communication, and advertising that can help us think about strategic opportunities to manage communication for better public engagement with science. And so with that, this is the question, the broad question that I am to pose is, what strategies and techniques can we use to engage the public, particularly in the context of federally funded science? So the first part of my talk today, I want to define some key terms so that we have a common lexicon to base our discussion from. Second, I did a landscape study in preparation for today's summit to see if there's an evidence base that exists in advertising, public relations, and marketing literatures to see if we can, specific to the context of federally funded science. And finally, I want to pose some questions and considerations for the remainder of today's summit. So we're all, some of us might be science communicators, others of us might be more accustomed to interacting with advertising, marketing, and public relations as consumers or stakeholders or target audiences. But I kind of want to go through the different functions, what their purposes are, and how we might, again, adopt these approaches in the context of federal basic research. And so a common concept that's used to kind of lump all of these terms together and as an umbrella term is integrated marketing communication. You also might have heard of corporate communication, which again serves to kind of organize these specific functions on the screen. Now, this table is a very basic way to think about these specific functions of advertising, marketing, and public relations, but hopefully it serves as a useful baseline to begin our conversation. And so advertising specifically is primarily focused with convincing specific target audiences to adopt brands, products, services, and ideas. Marketing is more concerned with specific products or organizations and pricing, placing, and promoting them in ways that facilitate uptake of those things. And finally, public relations is more concerned with the entire organization and establishing and maintaining mutually beneficial relationships between an organization's and the various publics that have relevant interest to the organization. So this also includes internal publics like employees, but also obviously diverse and varied interests outside of the organization as well. And so you might be thinking out of the gate, wait, we're going to talk about persuasion in the context of federal and science. Is that okay? What I would submit to you is that, yes, part of what undergirds this conversation is that we're going to adopt these strategies, or we should adopt these strategies to be effective, but we also do so ethically. We can acknowledge that marketing, advertising, and public relations doesn't necessarily enjoy the best reputation as disciplines or approaches, but still there's evidence-based literature that we can draw from to more effectively and ethically engage publics with science, and specifically basic science. So when we think about persuasion, think about opportunities to establish and or change opinions, attitudes, and behaviors in the context of science. So perhaps we want to increase interest in science. Perhaps we want to convince more people to consider careers in STEM fields. Perhaps we want to increase support for science funding. We want to inspire. Those are all inherently persuasion problems and contexts in which we could look to the literature to inform effective and ethical practice. A caveat to that is public relations is also not necessarily always concerned with persuasion and advocacy per se, but also because we're trying to establish and maintain mutually beneficial relationships, principles of dialogue and reciprocity and listening are also very important to the practice of public relations, so that we can, again, adjust what we're doing as an organization or an entity in ways that provide mutual benefit for our interests, but also the publics with whom we're involved and serve. Now, fortunately for us, there is a very robust scholarly literature in advertising, marketing, and public relations that talks about how to design messages and communication strategies to effectively and ethically persuade people, again, ethically. And there's a broad public relations literature that talks about ways that we can manage communication in the establishing and maintaining mutually beneficial relationships. There are also professional associations that host codes of ethics that can inform and should inform professional practice and decision-making and promote ethical behavior. Part of my goal today was to also see what this specific landscape, particularly in marketing, advertising, and public relations applications to basic science and federal basic science, what does the evidence base look like? Does an evidence base exist? And so in order to understand that, I conducted this landscape study. To do that, I used the Web of Science database to conduct two searches. One, I first looked at public relations, advertising, and marketing journals using keywords specific to basic science, federal science, and specific keywords related to federal science agencies. I also conducted a second search looking at key science communication journals. And because the science communication journals also focus on broader topics like science journalism, I really wanted to hone in on applications of public relations, advertising, and marketing. So for each of these journals, I looked at their evidence base from the journal's inception all the way to April 1st of this year. And in order for, let's see, the search originally produced about 220 articles. In order for these studies to be included in this landscape study, an article needed to focus on external public engagement. Again, that's what we're focused on here today. And so any of those instances where an article discussed internal engagement with employees, for example, or considered the internal infrastructure of an organization without an explicit focus on how that infrastructure might impact or influence public engagement, those articles were omitted from this analysis. Also, there were a few articles that misuse key terms that showed up in the search. So for example, a marketing article talked about astronomical price. That's not related to basic science. And also, even though I was kind of curious about this, nano influencers aren't necessarily influencers dealing with nanotechnology on social media. This is a term used to refer to a small scale social media influencer. So excluding those types of articles, the final sample resulted in 201 articles in total. And so I'm going to kind of break out the results of the landscape study based on the specific disciplines I looked at. So public relations accounted for only 11 articles, And the bulk of that evidence base primarily focused on crisis communication and specific events related to NASA. So I'm not going to go into detail on that, but I think we can all agree that crisis communication is a very special, unique context for public engagement that we want our organizations to be prepared for, but that we don't want that to be the end all be all of our public engagement. Hopefully we can do other things more strategic and proactively. And so more relevant to our conversation today is there were just a few articles that focused on opportunities and challenges for public relations theory and practice in science. A lot of those articles tended to focus on more conceptual observations or opportunities and challenges in specific contexts. One article talked about how small nanotechnology firms work to build their brand identity. But again, this literature was far from exhaustive and perhaps generalizable. Next, the advertising journals focused for about 20 of the 201 articles. Exclusively, this literature talked about applications and discussions of neuroscience to advertising context. So rather than talking about how advertising can be used to engage the public with basic science, it was basic science applications to advertising effectiveness and understanding the mechanisms of how people process the neural mechanisms, social and cognitive mechanisms for how people process specific advertising configurations and so forth, implications for visual attention, memory, those types of things. This also mirrored a lot of the scholarly conversation, evidence base that existed in marketing, which marketing accounted for about 2/3 of the sample that I pulled. Again, applications and discussions of neuroscience, particularly to advertising and marketing context. A much smaller proportion of the literature did talk about biological, environmental, and technological influences on consumers' learning, problem solving, and decision making. Perhaps more relevant to our conversation, there were only a handful of articles, probably less than 10 total, that talked about factors influencing the successful management of research, development, and innovation. A couple of articles talked about predictors of attitudes and risk perceptions, particularly in the context of nanotechnology. And then one article talked about a federal agency's use of a social marketing approach. Again, the start of an evidence base, but not necessarily a robust and or generalizable evidence base for our specific federally funded science, basic science context. And finally, the science communication literature accounted for about 40 of the articles in this landscape study. A large chunk of those articles focused on critical and empirical examinations of marketing and PR applications as used by research organizations and corporations. This also included primarily conceptual and critical reflections on public engagement with science as a whole and progress of the field. So some of this was more observational rather than empirical. There were some content analyses of science media and examinations of science media influences, impacts, and perceptions. More relevant to our conversation, there were only, again, a handful of articles that looked at specific techniques for engaging the public and media outlets and garnering, for example, science coverage. Again, they were kind of one-off studies that looked at, for example, different techniques you could use at science festivals to try to engage the public, but they weren't necessarily systematic, generalizable, but again, are a good starting point for an evidence base in the future. So the big takeaway of this landscape study is there is a need and an opportunity for more programmatic evidence base specific to how we can apply public relations, marketing, and advertising to the context of federal basic science. We also have an opportunity to learn more from the core theories of these disciplines. So again, a lot of these studies tend to be one-off studies. If there is a basic science literature in this area, It tends to revolve around nanotechnology. That's the only emerging sub-theme, I would say, perhaps. But there are tried and true principles, again, in these larger literatures related to public relations, marketing, and advertising. And we have opportunities to test the core theories and assumptions and tenets of these theories to see if they also hold in federal basic science contexts. There's also opportunities to learn from other communication subdisciplines. For example, the domain of media psychology has for years amassed a very robust evidence base for the use of entertainment education for pro-social outcomes, such as increasing interest in topics, increasing information seeking, getting people to adopt pro-social attitudes and conservation behaviors, for example. There's also a very rich literature that talks about using narrative as a communication structure and its effectiveness. And so as this points, there's a large fragmented literature that exists that we can pull from for evidence to both inform and understand more effective and ethical strategies for public engagement, but we need a more concerted effort to understand these applications in federal basic science contexts. And so, given this information, what does that mean for us today? Fortunately, there are a lot of opportunities for future research, which I get really excited about as a scholar who studies this. But also you're going to hear from some really cool examples of how DOE affiliates have connected their work to popular culture and hopefully spur some ideas and conversation. And you're also going to hear from leading scholars in public relations and science communication who will talk about more specific evidence bases to help us engage the public in various contexts, such as social media and so forth. And finally, I want to pose some considerations and questions as we go throughout today's summit. Please share and participate, share your experiences and observations. And I would encourage you to consider the questions: how can we get basic science, or your organization, your lab, to show up in popular culture? What seems to work? What inspires people? What doesn't? Why? And then finally, are there ethical and practical concerns or issues that we should consider in discussion of these topics? Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to participating with you in the rest of this summit today. Thanks.
Thank you, Matt. That was great. So before we go into questions, we're going to hear from Lisa Beth Kovetz. She's a senior writer and producer at CUNY TV and the showrunner on a nationally distributed PBS show called Science Goes to the Movies. So Lisa Beth, would you take us to the movies?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you, Matthew, and thank you for that introduction. I'm going to share my anecdotal thoughts. After 11 seasons of running Science Goes to the Movies. On the show, we've interviewed top working scientists, asking them questions about real science and pop culture fictions. We strive to compare culturally shared dreams and fears reflected in our movies and TV shows to what scientists currently understand as might be possible in the future, and how these cultural visions relate to the science our guests are actually working on in their labs. And I'd like to share with you today some thoughts about the overlap versus the disconnect between popular culture and real science, also known as reality, and why I think understanding that gap is imperative to the health of our democracy, and maybe how we might close that gap a bit. Let's start with this guy. On January 1st, 1818, Mary Shelley published Frankenstein. And for anyone visiting from another planet, in this Gothic horror novel, the arrogant Dr. Frankenstein, determined to be seen as a great and powerful scientist, tries to zap life back into a body with electricity. And both in and out of the book, the world was horrified by the monstrous creation the deluded and dangerous Victor Frankenstein made from human flesh, electricity, and a stopped heart. In Mary Shelley's story, the idea of a scientist resurrecting a stopped heart was an affront to nature. And it stayed that way until 1930, when an engineer named William Cohenhoven invented the electric defibrillator. And please, just for fun, please enjoy this amazing circa 1930s picture of William Cohenhoven. Dude was having a good time. He knew who he was. What Mary Shelley described as blasphemous, arrogant wizardry is now our standard medical practice. We would be horrified to lose a patient for the lack of something as basic as a defibrillator. Dr. Frankenstein used electricity to make a monster, but we no longer vilify that method of depolarizing and restarting a heart. For us now, that electrical shock to the heart is the science that saves us. Cause for celebration. And yet not that much has changed about how we portray science in our pop culture stories. Fast forward to the other day, I was watching a sci-fi show called The Imperfects. Feel free to judge my TV viewing habits. It's a Canadian series about a fictional geneticist who, in trying to cure some super hot young people of a deadly disorder, fiddled with their genes, saving their lives, but also giving them unwanted powers. And in one scene, one of the hotties was shouting into their cell phone, asking another hottie on the other side of the world, why are scientists so evil? With no thought to the astonishing gadget facilitating their drama or the science that put those amazing communication devices into their hands. As hotties, both real and fictional, can sometimes do, they experienced only their own intersection with the geneticist's work and then blamed all of science, a monolith writ large, for, in this case, the terrible inconvenience of now shooting lasers out of their eyeballs. It was a fun show. And there have been an enormous number of cultural shifts between Frankenstein in 1818 and the show I watched last week, but there is a fairly consistent through line in our popular stories. Movies and TV will often portray science and scientists in a negative light. But from James Bond to Inspector Gadget to R2-D2, everybody loves what science creates. We love the phones, we love the defibrillators. In myriad science fiction stories, science is scary, but the stuff that science makes is fantastic. And that lopsided spread of affection extends to the real world. For lots of people, science is frightening, but we want what it makes for us. And more than ever, we need what it makes for us. Of course, clearly, we've come a long, long way since the Gothic horror and scientific hubris that Mary Shelley built into her monstrous creation, Dr. Frankenstein. Through the late 1800s, writers like H.G. Wells and Jules Verne presented us with a new model of the scientist as a skilled and thoughtful adventurer, seeking out strange new worlds, new life, new civilizations, boldly going, if you'd like to say it with me at home, please feel free, where no one had gone before. Fiction, and particularly science fiction, reflects what we want, what we hope for in our societies. In 1966, the year Star Trek premiered on NBC, was a tough year for America. Bombings in Hanoi, riots in Cleveland, and at the center of the now massive sci-fi world created by Gene Roddenberry sits Star Trek's Federation planets like a beacon of hope. In the future envisioned by Roddenberry, humanity found a way to settle our earthly differences. And following in the footsteps of Wells and Verne's, the Star Trek characters travel the galaxies, striving to create an orderly world built on kindness, reason, logic, and science. Other space operas followed. And in movies like The Martian and TV series like The Expanse, potentially functional science plays a very significant role. The writers and producers of those shows consumed real physics and knit it back into the very bones of their drama. I did a whole episode of Science Goes to the Movies on the science reality built into The Expanse. Showrunner Naren Shankar, a Cornell-educated BS/MS PhD in applied physics and electrical engineering, created a potentially functional universe of space travel. And those details and possibilities have delighted the heck out of physics fans everywhere. But does the application of real science in our fictions matter to the larger society? I think that's a bit like asking, is there something thrilling about having a dream come true? Because standing where we are now, we have already had so many sci-fi pop culture dreams come true. For any of you who might be old enough to remember the flip phone and also nerdy enough to love Star Trek, the original series, tell me you didn't flip that phone open at least once and say, beam me up, Scotty. Imaginative, science-positive, pop culture fictions allow us to rehearse both ideas and technology we think we might like to have in our society. And Star Trek in particular inspired generations of future scientists. It's given us a motherlode of tablets and communicators and fabricators and visual phone calls. And it has shown us myriad crew members who were significant to the operations of the mission while also being differently abled or just different. And when those items came into our real lives, we'd already had a little bit of experience with them through our fictions. When those ideas started changing our society, they were more than just dreams to us. They were our expectations. We had rehearsed them. Episode after episode, we'd come to see the importance and the positive outcomes of a world built on kindness, reason, logic, and science. And yes, real scientific advancement absolutely requires math and labs and universities to come to fruition. But to start out, it needs a dream. And the world of pop culture is a huge collective dream factory. That's the good news. That's the fun news. On the other side of the coin, in our postmodern world, we seem to have taken several steps backwards in our portrayal of modern fictional scientists. The mad scientist, the power-hungry scientist, the incompetent, socially maladapted scientists are some of our most loved, often used cultural tropes. Early in the run of Science Goes to the Movies, I invited a very cool physicist onto the show, thinking he would love to discuss the Big Bang Theory, and he said, absolutely not. He hated the show. Why, he asked, why does every fictional scientist also have to be so unathletic and awkward, and for some reason, strangely dressed? Why do we portray our best and brightest in this way? In a 1992 paper called The Moral Character of Mad Scientists, Christopher P. Toomey wrote that the mad scientist character is an exercise in anti-rationalism, a homily on the evils of science, and that these mad scientist stories exist to show, quote, that the rationalist science is dangerous to one's spiritual well-being because it's too clinical, too abstract, and that the scientists who control the mysteries of modern secular knowledge are unaccountable to conventional standards of morality. But, you know, a lot of professions get a bad rap. Used car salesmen, IRS agents. But if positive cultural portrayals of science and scientists lead to more people getting excited about science, if positive rehearsals of science lead to an easier integration of rational thought, not to mention the creation of more better science-based products, gadgets, and procedures, what might the negative pop culture visions of science yield? Amazon Prime had a series called Utopia about a fake pandemic manufactured by a global cabal of scientists in order to trick the world's population into accepting a vaccine that would render a majority of humans sterile. Unfortunately, it premiered in September 2020. It was well done, scary. There were shadowy organizations and global conspiracies. The scientist portrayed by John Cusack was ruthless and determined to reduce worldwide populations by any means. Utopia was created long before COVID. The timing of the release was accidental. Nonetheless, just as Star Trek allowed us to rehearse tablets and communicators, logic, and intergalactic cooperation, Utopia was an unfortunately timed rehearsal for reasons to believe in the existence of intricate worldwide conspiracies and cabals willing to create deadly viruses. And it offered lots of terrifying reasons not to get vaccinated. And maybe the negative portrayals of science in our pop culture offering will have damaging effects on individual decision-making. Maybe a consistent cultural consumption of stories that feature mad, bad, downright evil scientists will make an individual viewer uncomfortable with real-world science. But does that have any effect on science writ large? So what if the general public doesn't really care for science? If our movies and television fictions have more negative stories and tropes about scientists than positive ones? The portrayal of the mad, power-hungry, the incompetent, socially maladapted scientists, oh, that's just sticks and stones, and we're grown-ups. To come to fruition, real scientific advancement just needs math and labs and universities and, oh yeah, right, and government. Scientific advances need government, and not just to pay the bills. Publicly supported scientific advancements are publicly owned scientific advancements. Corporate science will create things to make money for the corporation. Public science is created for public good. And because we live in a democracy, government support of science and scientists is tied to the will of people. So I hate to drag you all back to middle school, but being popular matters. It also matters that our society likes and accepts the rational mindset of science. I was walking my kid to school one day, and up ahead, I saw a little girl screaming at her mother. I figured the poor kid was tired or cranky or her shoes were too tight, but oh no. This little girl was having a full-on existential meltdown on her way to second grade. She was shouting at her mother, "I want it to be real. You need to make it real." To which her mother calmly and maybe with a little tinge of sadness replied, "No, sweetheart, Harry Potter is a story. Magic is not real. That's not how the world works." I love magical stories, and there are a lot of them to love. But maybe we should add a little warning label to them that reads, "Magic is not real. That's not how the world works." Because in our current world, the ideas of magical thinking have leaked into what should be logical, rational discourse, and it has stopped being fun. And there are an unfortunately large number of examples of this. But I think I can sum up the terrifying drag backwards away from a fact-based cause and effect, reasonably Newtonian world in just 2 words: flat Earth. So who's going to swoop in and save us from this terrible backward slide into a world where people who can read can also believe the Earth is flat? You are. You are the heroes we need, the scientists, the educators, the communicators. But don't shimmy into your spandex tights and flowing capes just yet. Science and scientific ideas best interact with the general public on a human level. When I pitched Science Goes to the Movies to the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, one of my major promises to them was that we would show the human side of individual working scientists. On the show, we try to hook our general audience by talking warmly and comfortably about movies and culture, then segue into the scientists' hopes and dreams and how, as humans, scientists get up and go to work each day to try and solve problems. Making a scientist human is the easiest thing to do. Scientists are very rarely mad, power-hungry, incompetent, or socially maladapted. They are often very well-dressed. Scientists are amazing human beings. They are artists, striving towards their dreams and vision. They're just doing it in an extremely rational, very functional, fact-based way. And yes, like any other swath of human population, some of the real scientists we interact with are going to be Big Bang Theory level, unathletic, and awkward. But if they have something important to communicate, it's on us to figure out the best way to bring the scientist's message to the general public. As a showrunner, I've had a hand in everything that happens on Science Goes to the Movies, and it's given me some very specific thoughts on how a scientist can better communicate to the general public in an entertaining manner. First off, on very nearly every show, we would have to reshoot, sometimes as much as double, to allow the scientists to comfortably explain the intricate details of their work. And while those details are imperative to science and the scientist, brevity is the soul of TV. Most of our guests were digging down into rabbit holes of very specific points, important to the science, important to the scientists, but lost on a general audience. And I cut them out. I cut them hard in the name of entertainment. So when you talk about or coach a scientist to talk about the ideas of science, remember humanity, brevity, and let's add to that simplicity. How simple? Can you explain your research to a child? In 2017, a group out of Washington trying to help scientists learn how to communicate enlisted children of different ages to hear the scientists explain their work. That experience required the scientists to distill their efforts and finding down to the basics. And when you tell the story of science, the basics are often the same. What problem did you identify? How are you trying to solve it? What will the solution do for us? What will it create for the rest of us? Problem, solution, result. Maybe a nifty new gadget. A good, simple, brief human story. And if you feel the research or work that you or your scientists are communicating or promoting is too complicated for this kind of simplicity, that it does not drive towards creating a specific, easily understood solution or result, remember what Newton said: "If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." And every new discovery that can be replicated in labs around the world adds another inch to that giant's height. And while the result might not produce a fabulous gadget or short-term, highly visible gains, we really, really need that giant to keep getting taller. And yes, it is more difficult to communicate rational facts in an entertaining manner, particularly to an audience that isn't terribly interested in rationality or facts. If you want it as a formula, the less an individual feels they need to know something, the more entertaining the presentation must be. And it does not matter if, for their own survival, your audience actually does need to know the information you want to share. If I may draw your attention to the lengths that airlines are willing to go to make their safety videos entertaining. That's a video about how to save your life if something terrible happens in the next few hours. And most of us really can't be bothered to watch it. What makes something entertaining is very complicated, but here is my suggestion. Science entertainment needs to be done briefly, humanly, simply, and heroically. Jules Verne, H.G. Wells, Gene Roddenberry, and Naren Shankar all see scientists as heroic adventurers. Joseph Campbell, in his book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, wrote, "A hero ventures forth from the world of common day into regions of supernatural wonder. Fabulous forces are there encountered, and a decisive victory is won. The hero comes back from this mysterious adventure with the power to bestow boons on his fellow man." And that is kind of a scientist's daily routine. Get up, get dressed, try and save the world. Maybe come home with functioning solutions or big ideas or nifty new gadgets to bestow as boons upon your fellow humans. Science is an ongoing heroic story. The scientists are lead characters in a massive, multi-level, multiplayer drama. They are on a mission to save the world, to solve a problem, improve lives. And if we share the story of science heroically, briefly, simply, humanly, maybe we can build a bridge into our current entertainment landscape, unlearn our cultural dislike for science, and maybe just get science and scientists on the right track to bring some facts and rationality back to our worldview. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Lisa Beth. That was fantastic. I really enjoyed that. We have a very lively chat going with a lot of thoughts and feelings. If you have questions for our presenters, please feel free to drop them in now, and we will, go through those as we can. I have a couple of just starting questions, and these are questions that formed as we talked. So, let's chat through them as I go through them. So we talked a little bit about, so Matt, you talked about the disciplines of marketing and advertising, and Lisa Beth, you mentioned that things are very consumer focused. And so, we as entities, as science, we don't have something for consumers. We don't have, as discovery scientists, we don't have a product. And how do we kind of translate those things from advertising, marketing? There's a lot of papers about how you do advertising and marketing effectively. How do you do that when you don't have a product to sell, when you're selling an idea or a feeling? Because that's really what we're doing. We're selling ourselves, our institutions. So how do we do that and use the lessons that we've learned from these different areas and apply them to ourselves? And I know that's kind of what your paper discovered we don't have. Right?
So the way that I think about advertising, marketing, and public relations, and primarily I'm biased in that I prefer public relations, just given its orientation and so forth. But the way that I see the principles and practices, it really relates to ideas just as easily as it relates to issues or interests or specific organizations or even brands. Like I always pick on Taylor Swift when I teach class because people like Taylor Swift. But the same principles and practices can be applied regardless of scale or topic. The fundamental, for example, concern in public relations can honestly be translated to interpersonal relationships. So if I'm trying to establish or maintain a relationship with you, I need to listen to you. Maybe I'm advocating for my position because I have interest as a scientist or as an organization, but I might tell you my side or what my interests are, but I also need to have a feedback loop, and that needs to be an authentic feedback loop. I need to listen to you, consider your interests, and kind of adjust what I'm doing in ways that we both win. And I think that type of orientation, again, regardless of selling a product or trying to get people to believe in this political issue or which I'm not proposing we do in federal government context or anything, but regardless of the topic, I think the principles still stand, if that answers your question.
Thank you. And so it kind of sounds like, so you both mentioned kind of connection and really making sure that people see the humanity in scientists and connecting ourselves to them. What do you see as kind of concrete ways we can make that connection, either through pop culture or in other manners? That's something that I think a lot of people struggle when you're doing communications on a large scale.
You know, I think that to avoid stereotypes is the main thing. When we first started the show, so many scientists, everybody asks when they come on TV, what do you want? What do you want me to wear? What should I wear? But the scientists always ask, do you want me to wear a lab coat? So do you wear a lab coat? Do you wear a lab coat in your actual work? No, I'm a mathematician. So I think avoiding these stereotypes, avoiding the white lab coated, again, avoiding the unathletic, socially maladapted visions of scientists, I think is extremely significant when we present, and not that hard. I think that a lot of times we have leaned in to science tropes because we believe, correctly so, but not for the best, that is what the public wants to see when they see a scientist, that we are going to be more comfortable with somebody who's amazing if they also have astonishing flaws. And I think that we should avoid that. Scientists are artists and amazing people, and we shouldn't give in to the public's idea of what they should be, what they might be. I mean, even Bill Nye, I see in the chat, we're talking Bill Nye, great guy, off camera. We had him on the show. Off camera, he's very smooth. He's very charming, he's really coordinated, and he doesn't wear a lab coat. So that, I think the avoidance of stereotypes is a significant step forward.
And that's something we talk a lot about in our office and in our community, is about representation and how representation matters, and people being able to see themselves in a scientist position, and having that representation is really important. And I think that's, you know, the stereotype piece of that is definitely fits in there. Let me see if there's any questions that we've come in. Talking a lot about different examples of pop culture and how scientists are displayed. So question for you, how can we include popular culture in our written video products without sounding like we're advertising a movie or other pop culture item? You know, we can't endorse anything. And I think this is a question we'll discuss throughout today, but maybe you guys can get us started.
I think Matthew said it. He references Taylor Swift. He's not selling Taylor Swift. but he references her because it gets people's attention. We often have this question on the other side. How can we talk about a movie without pissing off the movie company? We're not criticizing the movie. We're not selling the movie. We're talking about the science in the movie. I think that in the same way that parables and novels were once our common culture, movies and videos are now our common culture, and tropes and memes. And so I think to reference those things gets everybody's attention. Does it work in a class, Matthew?
Sometimes it depends.
Oh.
Lower level, maybe not as much. I would also just echo, I think Lisa Beth did a fantastic job in talking about how to make communication relatable and so forth. But I would also echo kind of what she said too, to think about communication and the structure of your messaging in ways, and sourcing of messaging that which dovetails what we've been discussing in terms of representation and so forth, to make it more relatable and engaging. Again, I mentioned, I think in my talk, that there's a robust literature that exists to talk about the effectiveness of using narratives. And it's kind of intuitive when you think about it. When we all encounter an advertisement, do we encounter that and think, oh yeah, I'm going to be persuaded. Let's see how many of these I can buy, or if, they're convincing me now. A lot of times, unless it's the Super Bowl or something, we know what their purpose is, and that they've paid to place this persuasive message to convince us to do something. With the narrative, we don't encounter those in the same way. We oftentimes do so for escapism, for enjoyment, for entertainment. And so again, if we're using narratives and embedding our messages, for example, in a narrative format, they're more likely to be engaging just because we engage those formats for those purposes anyway. And so again, just to echo what Lisa Beth has said, I agree wholeheartedly.
Exclamation points on what you said. Everything is story. We communicate with story now. And everyone out there, the people that either you or the people you're working with, have amazing stories. They are there. Scientists have overcome astonishing things, either intellectually or personally or what have you, to without capes and tights, to save the world. So the stories are there. It gets a little bit more complicated. Entertainment is lightning in a jar. Who would have ever thought kittens would take over the internet? But
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. We, again, in our community, we talk about storytelling and how important it is in science communication to, again, develop that relationship, that connection with your audience, because they need to feel like they are a part of it, or that they have some investment in that. And I think one of the things that we struggle with pop culture is how do we make that connection with pop culture and still connect with our story? And so, it can come off a little shallow sometimes if you're, just playing off the latest pop culture thing. You're just inserting it, and it's not really, doesn't really go with what you're doing, or, you don't want to come across necessarily as you're just jumping on the bandwagon. So I think there's a level of authenticity that you also have to engage there. And so that can be very challenging for a lot of communicators that are doing these things. So a couple of questions. Matt, you mentioned a paper that presented techniques to engage the public in basic science. What are these techniques in the paper? What are the techniques that the paper covered?
So typically there were a couple, I think, in each literature that kind of discussed more at a conceptual level how we can borrow from general broad principles to engage the public with basic science. There were a couple of instances, I think, in the science communication literature that I mentioned that talked about techniques like audiovisual, or I think one actually looked at 42 different types of techniques you could use at a science festival to engage. And so I don't know that there is a broad generalizable answer to that. I think it depends on the audience and where their attention is and what channel or messaging works for them, which is a great non-answer. And I can't recall that specific paper or those specific papers findings off the top of my head, but I'm happy to, if you want to follow up with me via email, I'm happy to provide those papers to you.
Okay, great. This is maybe a question for Lisa Beth. Any best practices on how the communication of science can reference pop culture in a way that feels appropriate, for example, for government, and doesn't infringe on intellectual property restrictions? So you talked a little bit about movies and how you portray them, but
so I'll work backwards. So the IP issues in terms of fair use are something that come up a great deal for us. And fair use it has become a very broad category now. If you're talking very specifically about Star Trek, in Star Trek this happened, then you have the fair use to use it as you like, particularly as a not-for-profit. I think we're a non-commercial not-for-profit, so I don't know how that would translate to a commercial world, but I assume most of our guests are also not-for-profit. So fair use is very broad. If you mention it directly, you absolutely can use it. If you don't mention it directly, don't touch it. For instance, we did a whole show and we were talking about all of the Marvel characters being so common and so understood, and for whatever reason we suddenly decided we were just gonna go to the Marvel Lego superheroes, because we were talking about how superheroes were just everywhere, and we had such a great time putting it together. And when it got to our lawyers, they were like, no, unless you actually talk about the Marvel Lego universe, you cannot. And we had to go back and put regular things. So the intellectual property issues are fairly generous when you're in non-cultural. I'm so sorry. Would you remind me what the first half of the question was?
Let me go find it again. Best practices on how the communication of science can reference pop culture in a way that feels appropriate.
So the best thing to do is to sit there. If you think that the movie or the pop culture that you're going to reference fits in with what you're studying, look at that with a piece of paper and a pencil and be very detailed on what it is that you think the reference is, because like anything, a vague detail doesn't resonate. But if you say, I can't think of an example in short term, but if you want to reference something very, very specifically, hit exactly what it is, and then the actual reality of that overlap will resonate. Vagueness will kill you. Details will get everybody excited.
Yeah,
I think too, just to add to that, at least from a PR practitioner standpoint, I think there are opportunities to potentially embed science in ways where it's not, it's secondary, but it also could perhaps facilitate interest. So a lot of times in PR, we talk about, or in advertising, you talk about product placement, but also there are folks who work in issue placement. For example, if you want to bring awareness to domestic violence, maybe you advocate to get that featured in Law and Order SVU or something like that, or resources, or bring awareness to issues related to that. And so in a similar way, we could think about science as issue placement and creating strategic opportunities to embed it, again, where it's not necessarily the focal point, but it's ubiquitous and salient in popular culture representations.
I agree 1,000%. And then the professional storytellers will tell your story, and that's huge.
Yeah. And as I was listening to you, Lisa Beth, you were talking, giving examples about representations, and it seems to me that the discovery science, so the initial phase of discovery science, that's almost always represented as equaling some problem or, you know, some issue with the scientist or with the science itself. Whereas the later stage science, so applied science, is almost always, you know, it's beneficial to the public in some way. And it's kind of an interesting representation. I've not really thought about it in that way, that, you know, discovery science really is not portrayed well in pop culture. What can we do to get more of our stories into pop culture that are not so issue prone?
So pop culture is giant and huge, and some of the limitations, as I was speaking with our hosts, that the limitations of a government agency to push ideas onto media are, you're kind of handcuffed a little bit about what a government agency can do. I was discussing, I had a friend whose job was to be in Hollywood and push push British Columbia on filmmakers, push British Columbia down their throats with tax havens and slides, and that can't be done by a government agency. That can only be, that kind of thing, even for the greater good for science, can only be done by private agencies. But in Hollywood, it is very effective. She was very effective in getting people, getting studios to see British Columbia as a great place to shoot. But again, pop culture is so large, so that's the macro effect, is to really lobby for what you want. The micro effect, the nano effect, is those influencers. You know, can you go down to the Facebook level and be more excited about science? Can, you know, how do you support on a lower level, and quite specifically on that nano, on that Facebook level, on that YouTube and other levels, is getting people to stay excited about science after they leave elementary school, because elementary education and we're all for elementary science, but once you move out of that realm, it becomes a little bit more complicated. It becomes more expensive for schools, and it's very strange that for older kids it starts to become a negative, not even of themselves, but the culture sees older children who are staying interested in science as somehow problematic.
Yeah.
But I will also add I would like to add to my answer, I don't know. I mean, we're,
Well, like you said, lightning in a bottle, right? It's difficult, and you never know necessarily what's going to resonate, right, I think, with the public. I think oftentimes people are surprised by what gets picked up, and you know, and there are so many pockets now with social media. There's so many pockets of pop culture. You know, it was large before, and now it's, you can't keep up with it. If you're, and as government agencies, we're not allowed to be on TikTok. And that happens to be where a lot of the pop culture trends are, you know, starting, or that's where they live. So it's, I think, more difficult for us to kind of engage on the like entry level for a lot of those, because we don't have that access. So it's kind of, yeah.
And I would also add to that a quick plug, Persuasion, that's why it's super important to look to the evidence base that exists for, so we can't necessarily say, oh, if you do this, that tweet's going to go viral, or whatever social media thing that happens to exist, and whatever it's called when it gets a lot of attention. But we can perhaps create conditions that maximize the likelihood that it will. And I think that's where the social science basis in fields like advertising, public relations, and marketing can be useful. And if we don't know those questions, then we need to create a concerted effort to better ethically and effectively inform how to do those things. And I think we'll hear some of that in later conversations today, with particularly as it relates to social media. But I would also advocate for any folks who are doing these things. That's why it's also important to evaluate the effectiveness of the strategies that you implement. And so it's, public relations, marketing, advertising, they're cool. We're all experts in communication because we communicate every day, right? But it's super important, even if we don't have the resources to conduct primary research, or maybe we don't have access to the database of all the latest articles and evidence in these contexts. We at least need to have a basis for justifying why we would allocate time, money, and resources to communicating in this specific way to these specific people. And so I would also encourage to add on evaluation to make sure strategies are effective.
Fantastic point. We're all working with limited resources, and we want to use them as effective as possible. And one of the ways to do that is through looking at the literature. For practitioners who have not delved into the literature before, or have not had that experience of applying the theory side to the practice side, do you have any basic tips on how people can go about doing that, or entry level? How do we apply the theory and analysis to our practice?
Sure. One easy way, again, would be to collaborate with social scientists, because we're always looking for opportunities, particularly in communication. I always joke with people, but I'm also serious. I study communication, and I need a context in which to study it. So, for example, I collaborate with a lot of folks across campus, a lot of engineers, a lot of physical scientists, and so forth. And they'll say, well, what aspect of the science do you care about? I said, I don't care. I care about the social dimensions and understanding how to better communicate whatever it is you're trying to communicate to them. And so there are people and practitioners, researchers and practitioners, who stay up to date with the literature. Again, a lot of that literature tends to be fragmented. Some of it may or may not be generalizable to federal basic science context, but at least if it's hard to find that literature, I would recommend reaching out to practitioners or researchers who would be ecstatic to collaborate. I imagine I would be.
That's a great tip. Thank you. So do you think that pop culture should produce more educational shows and movies for youth and beyond, to show us scientists in a more positive light? I mean, I'm guessing the answer will be yes. How do we do that? I think the bigger question, how do we get that representation that we've been talking about?
Well, I work with a lot of scientists who come afterwards and say, how do I get a show? How do I make a show? And so it always comes down to money. It comes down to money and distribution. So grants would be great. It just comes down to money. There are lots and lots of people who are so eager. I think it would be a great opportunity for scientists who have these ideas for shows to meet with people who know how to make them. They come to, I love the people I love the guests and stay friends with them for a very long time. And they come to me sometimes with ideas for shows that I'm like, oh man, can we do a big explosive experimental show, a show about experiments in your studio? Who's going to clean that? No, we can't do that. So just sort of simple understandings of production, a seminar between scientists who want to do this and production people who have a little bit of know-how and a sense of what goes into a show. Like the scientists are such grant mavens, they really know, but then they don't always know what goes into what the elements of production are. So a meet and greet between scientists and production people would be extraordinary. Period.
And to take that, that's the huge, large show with production, but we have a question about influencers, which is kind of the nano version of that, and working with influencers to get your story told. Any tips or tricks or
why do you need an influencer? You're an influencer. Put the camera in front of your face and say your piece, and then show it to your sister, your mother, your kids, whatever, and say, what do you think? And they go, I can't understand a thing you're saying. Talk slower. Or that's the background that you want. Make it. That's the whole point of social media, that you can make it. And you do not need a nano influencer. You can be that nano influencer with growth potential. And here's the other thing that Matthew, I'm sure you'll support, that the algorithms favor volume. So if you make one and it doesn't go anywhere, you got to make 10. You got to make a lot. And just even if they're dumb, or sorry, dumb is not the right thing, even if they are not the optimal product that you would like to ultimately make, making 15 of them will please the algorithm in a disturbing way. And that volume just starts to go. I think, again, I cannot say it enough. Don't wait for somebody to anoint you a social influencer. It's you. Go.
I love that. That's great. And our labs, universities, you already have audiences. So you can do this. You just have to, you have to find a scientist who is willing to do this, or as a science communicator, you can do it. I mean, there's lots of people out there who don't have that background. So, so we'll have one more question, and then we're almost at time. So I'll give you guys a chance to wrap up if you have any final thoughts. How can we use our institutional voices to be more personal, as we know people relate to the more personal aspect of influencers or just pop culture?
Do you want to take it, Lisa, Beth?
I think it's if you want that, do it. I told you a story about the kid about walking to school and the little girl. That's the nature of storytelling, that you'll see it everywhere. Tell a story about how it intersected with your life. How do you be authentic? Unfortunately, you are authentic by being authentic. You look straight into the lens of the camera, maybe not with that bug-eyed sort of look that I just gave, but it is you. I mean, you are the thing already. You are authentic, you are excited, you are heroic. Go. And record it first and show it to your mom. Because cameras are weird.
Yeah. Well, we are, like I said, almost at time. So I'm going to give you guys a minute if you have anything to wrap up. We've talked a lot, kind of far-ranging conversation, but I think it's a good scene setter for today. So Matt, do you have anything you want to say to wrap up and launch us into the rest of the day?
Sure. I'll just thank everybody for their time and attention, and I look forward to participating in the rest of the summit with you to continue these conversations. And if anybody's interested in anything that I shared or would like to follow up, please feel free to reach out via email. I'll be glad to help. It's just my last name, VanDyke @apr.ua.edu, and I can put it in the chat too.
Thank you. Lisa Beth?
What Matt said, and I would be delighted to reach out, lbkovetz@gmail.com. I'm going to put that in because Kovetz is a weird spelling.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right, so that concludes our episode 2 of our show today. We're going to go into our commercial break right now. And that will be 2 of our Flash Talk videos. And then you can also find those in the Flash Talk gallery in the kind of conference space. So we're going to show those, and you are welcome. Please watch them, come back. And I think the next session starts at 12:30. So in 10 minutes, we'll get going with episode 3. So thank you, everybody, and fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, everyone.